of us in the labor movement, if we just talk about union workers for a minute, realize the crisis we're in. And I'm not going to spend even a minute on it. We have the smallest level of collective bargaining coverage, meaning the percentage of our 130 million workers in this country who have any kind of voice to meet with their employer, whether they're public or private sector, in the last 2 centuries, 21st and 20th. We're back to the 19th. So, while clearly, as Alessandra said, we learn a lot from history, don't count on it. We make our history, each one of us, in terms of how we live. And if we've learned anything new, and I think we have, in the last 5 or 6 years, it's that the democracy in this country is broken in many ways. This is why I was proud to be one of the 4 conveners of the Democracy Initiative. And the other 3 are the NAACP, Greenpeace, and the Sierra Club. So when we talk about community labor partnership, I actually would change that frame to progressive partnerships. What do we learn from 26 years of Jobs with Justice? It's that we sit at a common table, not a labor table with partners. Almost everyone in this room comes from a labor table, but with less than 12% of working class people in this country in labor unions, if we continue to think of labor first, we'll all be last. And so, and as proud of each of us are of our own unions, I spent my whole life in this union, from one place to another. Not that important, except to me and my family. It's not going to be my union. It's not even going to be my labor movement or my AFL-CIO or SEIU or NEA or the Teamsters, other unions that are key in the labor movement. It's going to need to be a new kind of movement that links together what we all thought, quite frankly, we had begun to win, at least begun to win, when we elected Barack Obama and the 111th Congress, which was a movement for economic justice against the backdrop of the worst collapse of this economy in 80 years. And what did we learn? We learned that the democracy blocks, the blocks to a democracy, prevented really any substantial economic reform between 2009 and 2011. And the right wing came back up. Based on racism, we had an African-American president, but just as much funded by that 1%, not even, that Occupy was about. And Occupy might have been sloppy in some ways, messy in other ways, but if there's anything we better learn from these last 5 years, it's not to continue to repeat them. It's that we're all going to have to be messy in some ways. Yeah, Eliseo and I got arrested together in front of the Capitol with 40 other folks from many different groups, this broader movement, mostly immigrant rights folks, to send a signal not to believe for a second that that was going to change Boehner or the Republican majority in the House, but believing absolutely that it would be a signal to our organizations, all of them, whether community or labor or civil rights or green or democracy groups themselves, that we were ready to have massive demonstrations and civil disobedience across this country, including the sit-ins. And I was proud that 2 CWAers were there in McCarthy's office, along with others from labor and community and dreamers and undocumenteds. If we learn one thing from meeting here these days, it's we better be ready under attack to stand up and fight back. To stand up and fight back. And so These four stories are part of a much broader narrative of how we link the economic issues that every union activist understands. The issues that we bargain for, the issues we organize around, the issues we push legislation, our jobs, our health care, our retirement, our actual bargaining rights themselves in the worst shape in 2 centuries. But at the same time, we need to understand that immigration is one of only 4 major blocks to that economic change. And too many of us continue to send people out election after election, believing all we have to do is do the same things people did since the civil rights movement and that will change this country. We will not. We have to look at the blocks in this democracy. What prevents us? And no doubt, immigration reform is number 1, with 11 million people that can't vote. But number 2, as we heard from Josie, voting rights. 70% of American citizens are registered to vote. That's the lowest in the world, by far, of any democracy. That's 30% are missing. Those 30% are almost all working class people and families. Almost all. And the right wing comes on the attack. And we go on defense about voter ID, about eliminating early voting, and on and on. 70% of citizens registered to vote is the same as it was in 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed. Voting rights is no longer about people of color. It's about what we stand for. Progressive people in this country will not win the kind of majority we need in a democracy that we need to build almost over again unless voter registration is in the 90s. And when we elect governors or secretaries of state, we need to say to them now, voter registration, as I said to Terry McAuliffe, who's running for governor of Virginia, against a right-winger so that anybody will choose him, frankly, over Cuccinelli. And that's how they win elections. And he raises a lot of money. I said, Terry, Virginia has 68% voter registration. You'll be governor only 1 term. What will you do to use every state office to register voters when people come in? And will you pledge now that when you leave in 4 years, because we will help you get elected, you'll get that to at least 75%? We've got to do that in every state, with every candidate we support. We've got to end this lesser of 2 evils. We've got to build a political movement that's about what we stand for in terms of jobs and health care and retirement and workers' rights, not just about choices that are thrown into us. Number 1, immigration, 11 million missing voters. Number 2, voting rights, 30% not registered, so can't vote. Number 3, money in politics. That election in 2012, just the federal election, just the president, 33 senators, 435 members of the House, most of which didn't have contested elections, maybe a nominal candidate. $7 billion. That's not what democracy looks like. That's up $1 billion from 4 years ago. No pay increases for American workers, on the average, none in those 4 years, but another $1 billion thrown into the slop house of our federal elections. And virtually all of us in this room supported President Obama's re-election, but that strategy was mostly based on money. President Obama himself moved away from pledges he had made 4 years before because in their eyes, they had no choice, or the right-wing Republican candidate continually moving to the right because that's where the Tea Party takes them. Number 3, then, money in politics. We've got to get voters in, whether immigrants or not. We got to get money out. We got to understand that if we don't unite those issues with what we care about most, we're never going to see what we care about most. And number 4, the U.S. Senate. Now, in the case of immigration, somewhat different story, because as we all know in this room, the role of particularly Latino voters in particular states like Arizona, where even Republicans like Flake and McCain are scared shitless, frankly, and even in Texas, about what will happen if they are perceived as anti-immigrant. And as Eliseo said, that realization is a critical force for change at this moment in this country. But let's talk about the 111th Congress. When Barack Obama won, much more as the community organizer he used to be than as the great fundraiser he's become. The 111th Congress passed 400 pieces of legislation led by Nancy Pelosi in every single one of the areas that working class people, that everyone in this room holds dear. They passed the DREAM Act. They passed Disclose. They passed real economic stimulus. They passed a health care bill that wouldn't have just been the smallest possible step forward, what we got with the Affordable Care Act, but real health care reform, where every employer would have had to provide real health care or else pay massive taxes. And most importantly, for those of us in this room, they twice passed overwhelmingly the Employee Free Choice Act that would have allowed private sector workers across the country to organize again without the oppression of their employer on their neck. Those 400 pieces of legislation didn't get discussed for 1 second in the U.S. Senate because of the way the rules are now interpreted. A cozy coalition of all of the minority party, the Republicans, with too many Democrats to prevent change. And so this democracy initiative is about taking these issues, Senate rules, money in politics, voting rights, uniting that with the immigration reform movement so that we have a path. Instead of just saying to each generation, well, here's what you do, like you learned in 5th grade civics class. Well, in 5th grade civics class, you don't learn about money in politics. You don't learn that we have the lowest voting rights in the world. You don't learn about 11 million immigrants that have no path to citizenship. And you certainly don't learn that we have a U.S. Senate that takes 60% to adjourn, let alone put a motion on the floor to debate. There's not a local union in this room that could get by for a minute if they functioned like the U.S. Senate. In fact, the U.S. Senate functions like the Senate of ancient Rome. So that's the bridge into community labor partnerships. In our union, we have a very simple education model in this booklet, Building a Movement for Economic Justice and Democracy. And it starts with the hurdles we have in front of us, the obstacles. But it ends with a charge to build a movement of 50 million strong. Not rhetoric about 50 million, but a chart that shows how we get to 50 million. And these stories are all part of that chart. They're not about really labor community partnerships. They're about a mass movement of 50 million that labor is a critical, essential part of. We can be modest, and we can work together. And it links some of the groups that we just heard about, but that unity doesn't fall out of the sky, whether you're Latino or Asian Pacific Islanders, or whether you're youth, or whether we're women, or whether we're green, or labor, or LGBTQ, or faith-based social justice, or jobs with justice, or any other categories that we talk about to get to 50 million. It doesn't fall out of the sky like the rain that you never see in Las Vegas. It only falls out of the sky when we work explicitly like these stories to build these kind of partnerships. And it only happens when we realize that as tough as each organizing drive is, it's going to be too tough. We'll still do it unless we build a different kind of movement in this country, and unless we take some of our resources and time in a meaningful way and throw in together, as we will hear here, but also throw in together for a hardcore democracy movement that looks much more like what you saw in Tunisia or Tahrir Square in Cairo than what we're used to here. It looks much more like the sit-downs in Delano from 50 years ago or the sit-downs in Greensboro. And it's a little bit beyond our imagination. And so I would say to each of you as you hear these stories and go to workshops after, that as nice as it is and inspiring to come to conferences and see folks who, like us, have a common vision, we really have to figure out what is a common vision, and wherever we live, in some small way, what are we doing? So in this booklet, there's 9 stories. Now we have a website. There's many more of just small but significant steps CWA locals are taking from the South and the East, the North, the West, wherever, and all these different industry groups to build these kinds of partnerships. And to say that while in years past, we focused on union organizing, and we still will. We focused on mobilization and tough bargaining fights, including probably more strike days than any other union, and a huge strike fund. We're not going to get there with that. We need to build this mass movement of 50 million and actually challenge the political thinking of the day. Those of us who will be at the AFL-CIO convention in just a few weeks, this is sort of a lead narrative coming into that convention. Lee Saunders from ASME and I are co-chairing a committee about our organizing and political work combined, not as 2 separate things. And it will all be stories like this, and it will all be these strategies, and people will know it's hard. It's no snap your fingers, you're going to see this. It may be a long time, like that fight for immigration reform, or the fight against Jim Crow, or the fights from the last century for workers' rights. But that's the only path we know at this point in time.